everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a big crowd. We're not used to this. So you're our first big crowd since COVID. So thank you so much for coming. We do have a simulcast room available. So if you're feeling a little hot or there's, not really comfortable with the amount of people in the room, we have that room available. So you're welcome to move over there if you're interested. If not, no worries. So I'm so excited to not only welcome one, but two authors for tonight's event. So we have local author DM Pulley. She's from Cleveland, and she's here moderating. And of course, you all know Ruth Ware is also here. So before we get started with my introductions for them, just have a couple of announcements. There will be time at the end of the discussion for a Q&A. So if you have a question, we ask that you please raise your hand, and myself and one of our staff members will come around with a microphone so that everybody can hear your question. There are a lot of you here tonight, so we will try our best to get around to everyone, but there just might not be enough time to get to everyone's question. The Learned Owl is also here with copies of both Ruth and DM's books, and both Ruth and DM are going to be available for signing after the event. The Learned also has copies of Ruth's newest book, which is 0 Days, that have been pre-signed. So those are available for purchase as well if you don't want to come to the signing afterwards. And then, like I said, there will be a book signing that will be in the rotunda directly following the program. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. So like I said, moderating tonight's discussion is DM Pulley. Before becoming a full-time writer, Pulley worked as a professional engineer, a career which inspired her first book, The Dead Key. She is the author of several historical mysteries that aim to shine a light on the darker side of life in the Midwest in the 20th century. And as many of you probably know, Ruth Ware is a best-selling author of In the Dark, Dark Wood, A Woman on Cabin 10, and The It Girl, among many others. Her books have appeared on bestseller lists around the world and been optioned for both film and TV and published in more than 40 languages. So welcome to you both. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Alexis. Can you guys hear me okay? And welcome, Ruth. Welcome to Cleveland and the cloud of poisonous gas that has decided to join us this evening. And thank you all for making the trip out. I love that we're all together, secluded, with a natural disaster going on. I'm sure none of us will get murdered. It is such an honor to talk with Ruth Ware. Like many of you, I'm sure she's one of my favorite authors. 8 blockbuster books. Hold on, my notes are going. They say that everyone has one book in them, but 8 blockbusters in 9 years. That's pretty incredible. Can we give her a hand for all the great books she's done? I can personally tell you how difficult it is to write book after book and have them be bestsellers, like truly incredible. So it's an honor to have you here with us. And I have to tell you all, I've read 0 Days twice now, and it's an edge-of-your-seat thriller with a great, fascinating character at the heart of the story. It will not disappoint you, and I can't wait to hear more about it and ask Ruth some questions. But first, would you guys like to hear Ruth say hello and maybe read a little bit from this amazing new thriller?
Well, I would love to do that, but first I have to tell you that I had a slightly... Is that okay? Can you hear me? I had a slightly stressful flight on the way over here. I had a very tight connection in Charlotte, which turns out to be quite a large airport. I was quite intimidated by the amount of walking I had to do. And Dee's latest novel really got me through it. I was reading it on the plane, and it's so gripping. I sort of didn't have time to stress about it. It's like this kind of amazing sort of, is it haunted? Maybe it's not. Too good to be true real estate. It's catnip, basically. If you loved The Haunting of Hill House, it genuinely took my mind off some very tense travel moments, but anyway, we're all good.
Thank you.
So 0 Days. Shall I start by telling you a little bit about it, and then maybe I'll read you a tiny snippet, and then we can chat about it in a bit.
Yeah, actually, I had a question about where the story came from, because I understand your stories usually begin with a character that inspires you and a question or scenario that you're interested in. So I was wondering if you could tell us what the question was at the heart of 0 Days. Like, what really got you to write it? Maybe that would be a fun way to talk about it.
That's a good question. So often my books kind of center around a sort of, I guess, like a what if that kind of scares me or chills me. You know, the kind of thing that you think about and think, well, thank God that hasn't happened to me. And this book's no exception, apart from the fact that it started with a character. It started with the character of Jack, short for Jacintha, who is my main character. And Jack is a pen tester, which is a term that I've had to get used to defining a lot over the course of writing this novel. Pen tester is nothing to do with pens. It's short for penetration tester, which sounds even...
Sounds more exciting.
Yeah. And that is why that is not a term that appears on the jacket. We thought it... I don't know what the... Amazon algorithms would make of a penetration tester, but I didn't want to find out. Basically, a pen tester is someone who kind of acts as an attacker for the purposes of testing a security system. So the idea is if you've got a really secure website or a secure database or a secure building, you don't really know how secure it is until someone tries to break into it. And ideally, you don't want the first person to test its defenses to be a real criminal. So you can hire people to basically use all the tools and techniques of real cyber hackers, or in the case of Jack, because she's a physical pen tester, real burglars, to try and test your security systems. And then, you know, you report back and you say, this held up, this didn't, this was great, your staff need to work on this. So I was kind of fascinated by the type of character who would choose to do this. You know, someone who would choose to learn all the techniques of quote unquote bad guys, but use them ethically. Because at the end of the day, Jack is basically a burglar. She's doing exactly the same things that a real burglar would do. She's trying to trick members of staff. She's picking locks. She's scaling walls. She's crawling through air conditioning ducts. Anything that she can do to get access to places where she shouldn't be. So she has this really kind of badass set of skills, but she has chosen to use them to make people safer rather than to enrich herself. So I started with the character of Jack, and most of my books are along the lines of a sort of regular person who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and something bad happens to them. And with Jack, she's not really a regular person in that sense. She's someone with a pretty unique set of skills. And I guess for that reason, I felt that she needed a challenge that would really test her. And so I gave her the worst possible what if that I could think of, other than something happening to my kids, which I'm just not even going to go there. That's just too bad to write about. But for me, the worst thing that I could think of happening was to lose the love of your life to murder, and then to have the police suspect you. And so that's what I inflicted on poor Jack. And that's what happens at the beginning of the novel. So Jack is out doing a routine pen test. There's a misunderstanding at the end. She gets picked up by the police. She can't immediately get hold of the person who hired her, so they have to take her into the station. And by the time it's all sorted out, her husband, Gabe, who is the digital side of their operation, is not picking up the phone, which is quite uncharacteristic. Jack drives home, she opens the front door, and she knows that something is wrong pretty quickly. And what she discovers is that while she's out, Gabe has been brutally murdered. His throat has been slit. He's lying in a pool of blood at his computer. And initially, the police are pretty sympathetic. They treat her like a grieving widow. They take her evidence. But she becomes aware fairly fast that they only have one suspect, and it is her. And so at that point, she has a choice. She can do the sensible thing, the thing that I would do, which is to sit tight and hope that it all gets sorted out, hope that the police do their job and find out who's really responsible for this. Or she can go on the run and try to solve his murder herself. And for various different reasons, some of which we might talk about, Jack makes the second decision. Partly because she's someone who's used to solving her own problems. She's someone who is not going to sit around while terrible things happen. But partly because she has a past, and that past involves a fairly hefty distrust of the police. So she walks out of a police interview and effectively decides to solve Gabe's murder herself. And in doing so, she obviously puts an enormous target on her own back. So yeah, I'll read you a tiny bit from, I'm not going to read you right at the beginning of the novel. I'm going to read you a little bit where Jack is in an interview with the police, and she's sort of starting to get the impression that maybe they don't entirely believe her. Okay. We're just trying to get as clear a picture as possible, DC Miles said. His voice should have been soothing. His tone was clearly meant to be sympathetic, but for some reason all of my hackles went up. But I've told you all this. I've already told you. This is like, it's Kafkaesque. My husband is dead and you're asking me about my phone battery? And you got home when? D.S. Malik asked, as if I hadn't spoken. Her voice was kind but brisker, as if she sensed that sympathy wasn't what I wanted. I think it was sometime around 4 a.m. I remember looking at the clock on the dashboard as I turned into our road. I parked, and then I opened the front door, and I shut my eyes, remembering the horror. The image of Gabe's mutilated throat rose up in front of my eyes, and I opened them again, feeling a jolt of that remembered terror and disbelief. Well, you saw. No footwear marks? No sign of a struggle? None. I shook my head. Any footprints you saw, that was me. There was nothing, no sign of anyone leaving. Just a smear of blood on the living room door handle. I remember that, because I saw it first and I knew something was wrong. And Gabe, how was he sitting when you found him? He was kind of slumped over his computer, I said. The numbness was stealing back over me, and I felt myself beginning to shake again. Not uncontrollably like before, more a strange, steady shivering, in spite of the warmth of the interview room and the hot mug of coffee clasped between my hands. If it hadn't been for the blood, I might have thought he was just asleep. He was... I swallowed, almost unable to think about it. He was still wearing his noise-cancelling headphones. I think whoever killed him, they must have come up from behind and... I stopped. I couldn't say it. Something in my throat seemed to close up, and I just shook my head. And then you did what? DC Miles asked. I tried to lift him up. I thought... I don't know. I think I thought maybe he'd passed out, hit his head or something. I'm not sure what I thought. I kind of pushed him back in his chair. He was really heavy, and at first I wasn't sure if I could move him, and then all of a sudden his weight shifted and he kind of flopped, and I saw his... I stopped. His neck, it was... I stopped again, breathing deeply through my nose, trying to hold it together. For a long moment, Miles and Malik said nothing, just watched me trying to control myself. And then Malik pushed a box of tissues across the desk and said softly, "I'm sorry. I know how hard this is."
That was great. Okay, so show of hands, who wants to sit here for the rest of the night and listen to Ruth Ware read the rest? Love the voice. I love knowing how to say Jacintha correctly, because that was a fun name. It's heart-wrenching. I mean, one thing that really struck me about the story is that it feels so real, and you really feel like you're going through this with her. It's a thriller, but it also has such strong characters. Could you tell us like where Jacinta Jack came from?
Oh, well, I suppose it was really that question of, I discovered the idea of pen testers and, these people who kind of break into systems for a living. And I was completely fascinated by the kind of person that you would have to be to want to do that job. Because essentially you're pretending to be, well, you are a burglar. You're effectively doing everything a real burglar does. And Jack's role, she doesn't just break into buildings. She has to use her people skills in order to deceive people, make them give up their passwords, find out information about the companies. So what she's doing is in some ways quite manipulative, but she's very much doing it in the service of, of security and trying to make people's lives better. And I was completely fascinated by the personality of pen testers. I listened to a ton of interviews with them, and they're incredibly interesting people and very generous with their time and anecdotes, and lots of the little details in the book were sort of ripped from the accounts of real pen testers. One of the interviews that I listened to with a female pen tester, and women generally make very good pen testers, she said that she had two props that were her most useful ones, and one was a fake baby bump, and the other one was an arm brace, and actually both of those made it into the book. And she said it was because if you are trying to force your way into a building, 9 times out of 10, if you're standing there with your arm in a sling and you're kind of, you're reaching for your pass and you maybe juggling some bags and you look like you've just got too much on, 9 times out of 10, someone will beep you in because they want to be a kind person. And she said, it's that sort of knowledge of human nature that enables you to be a good pen tester. But the other thing that I was really interested by was I listened to an interview with a hacker, someone firmly on the digital side. And he said that he thought that hackers were usually the kind of person, or more often the kind of kid, because they often start pretty young, who if they see a button marked "do not press," they have to press it because they have to find out what is going to happen. And I'm the kind of person that if I see a button marked "do not press," the building could burn down before I press that button, because I would be like, well, there's a sign, so obviously if nothing good is going to happen if I press it. But there is a very different type of personality for whom the torment of not knowing what that button is for, and of thinking, well, maybe there's a reason why they don't want me to press it, like maybe something cool is going to happen. There's a type of person for whom that is absolute catnip, and Jack definitely falls into that category. She's someone who just has to know stuff.
Yeah, I love the confidence game that she's constantly playing, and it really does expose. It's so interesting that it's exposing how nefarious people can be, but also how kind-hearted. It's an interesting like a mix of themes in the book, just like the kindness of strangers and then the very devious people that want to take advantage of it. You write Jack in the first person. In reading through your body of work, you write first person quite a bit. And I always am a little shy, like to put on, say I'm this character, I'm going to use I, me, I'm going to talk about it like it's happening to me. Do you have a hard time putting on the skin of these different characters, and are you anything like Jack at all?
Oh, what a good question. Yeah, I have kind of flipped back and forth. I've written, I guess, probably 2/3 of my book are in first person, in the I voice, and maybe 1/3 of them are in third person, he, she. And I don't really know how or why I make that decision, except that I try and kind of mix it up. I never like to write the same book twice, as you may have noticed. My books are quite often quite different, even though there are sort of themes running through them. So I think as much as anything, it's just a sort of way of keeping things interesting for myself in terms of, mixing it up a bit. But no, I don't feel shy about taking on other people's voices. In some ways, I think it's the most natural way to write, because, the storytelling art came out of someone sitting around a campfire telling a shaggy dog story about something that may or may not have happened to them, but it could have done. And so I think the I voice is a very natural one for me to slip into. there was another part to your question, and I was.
What
about
do
to
you
answer.
have in common
Oh,
with
what do I
Jack?
have in common with Jack? The answer is not a lot, as you may have noticed. I am very law-abiding. I'm absolutely the last person who would ever break in or out or, do anything with a building. And I'm also a very bad liar, which is weird because essentially I lie for a living. But, lying in a sort of safe, permitted way is very different. But I go incredibly red when I lie. And my husband always teases me that, I'm the worst possible liar there is. So I would be very, very bad as a pen tester. As soon as someone challenged my credentials, I'd be like, no, okay, you've got me. I'm the kind of person that which I've done several times this week, when I walk through airport security, I have the irresistible urge to confess the fact that I have some contraband in my bag, even though I don't. So I just have this consciousness of guilt. So I would not make a good pen tester. I guess all of my characters have something of me in them. And I think what is in Jack, which is, the kind of the terrifying what if of the story, is her love for her husband. The worst thing that I could imagine in my life, apart from something happening to my kids, which we won't go there, is something happening to my husband. And so the fact that happens to Jack and the strength of their relationship, that does draw quite a lot on how I feel about my other half. But I think if there is a character in the book who is most like me, it's probably Jack's sister, Helena. She has such a horrible time in this book, poor Jack. She has literally no one on her side. So I wanted to give her someone who would really be there for her, someone who would be unquestioningly in her court. And I am a big sister. And as previously discussed, I am very law-abiding, but the few people that I would break the law for, if I had to, not just for kicks, but if there was some really compelling reason, I would commit a crime for my kids and for my little sister. Not for my husband. He's a big boy. He can take care of himself. I love him a lot, but he can commit his own crimes. But my little sister, even though she's in her 40s, she's still my little sister, and I would still do anything for her. And I wanted Jack to have someone who felt like that about her. So I gave her a big sister, Helena, who would do anything for Jack and does do some slightly nefarious stuff in the book in defense of her little sister.
I love the dynamic of sisters helping sisters. That's a very cool. It is a nice touch point when you're going through literally hell, people. It's a crazy ride Jack goes on. But I'm curious. I've read, I've talked to other authors. Some people have a routine to get into the headspace of their characters. Some people will play music. Some people will, look at something or have a vision board to try to get in. Was there anything that you used to get into Jack's head since she is so different?
I kind of wish I had a cool answer for this, but the truth is I'm a very minimalist writer, and this goes for all my books. I don't really write anything down. I plot to an extent in that I have stuff in the back of my head that I'm, scenes that I'm excited to write about, and I almost always know the solution to the mystery in my books, because I think if you write the kind of crime that I do, it's really important to play fair with the reader. You need to drop those clues for your reader to enable them when you get to the end, they don't feel cheated. I never want my readers to be like, well, you didn't tell me he was a triplet, or whatever it is. I want people to feel like they've had a chance to guess the solution. Unfortunately, because crime readers are very sophisticated, that does mean some of them will get there ahead of my characters, maybe ahead of me, and that's okay. I think as long as the characters in a book are strong, wanting to know their fate, wanting to find out about them, will hopefully see you through. But no, I don't listen to music. I don't even really like people being in the house, which has been a problem since my husband has started working from home in COVID. I keep saying to him, wouldn't you like to get a nice, one of those co-working spaces that I keep reading about? And he's like, no, I'm fine here. So no, I don't have charts. The only thing I sometimes do, and this is more often for secondary characters who are being a bit elusive, is I will sometimes write a scene from their point of view or a letter in their voice to me or to the main character telling me something about themselves that they want me to know. And I find that's a very good way of getting into the heads of people who are proving a bit elusive. But I don't generally do that with my main characters because they're already talking to me. But what about you, Dee? I want to know what I'm going to shamelessly steal all your tips now. What do you do to get into the heads of your characters?
Oh, that's a good question. I will write extra scenes. I'll write. I know you tend to write in order. I tend to write the same. But in later works of mine, I've written out of sequence. Ooh. I've written little short stories. I love your letter idea. I think that's very clever. Sometimes I'll switch points of view. But I usually have some very real people in mind when I'm modeling my characters. Either
like actors or people in your life?
Well, like friends, family. I'll usually like mash together a couple people I know, or I'll take an aunt and make it an uncle.
Anyone else reconsidering their friendship with Dee at this point?
Nothing that they would actually do, but you try to get. I borrow a lot from real life. I love what Dan Shawn says. He's got like 8 characters and he just mixes them up like people that he's known and gives them different genders. I think it's a little bit more vague than that, but a lot of my characters are similar to me in some very tangible way. So trying to write a first-person narrative for a character like Jack who's so different from you in a personality way, I don't know. I might have to put on a leather jacket or put on some fancy shoes or some music or something or walk the dog really mad for a while. I don't know. But I do find that when I am writing, I do get into this zone where it's kind of like a dream state, and I try to explain it to family members or people who don't do it. Is that what it's like for you? It's kind of like, to me, it's like watching a movie in my head, and I just try to write what I see.
Yeah, very, very much. When it's going well, I have to say, it's not always like that. Sometimes it feels very performative. It feels like just writing words down and hoping that at the end of the day they'll make sense. And sometimes when I go back and reread my books, I can remember that I found those scenes really hard to write and didn't feel like they were flowing at the time. And sometimes they're the most enjoyable to read afterwards. So it just goes to show there's no correlation between how enjoyable a book is to write and how enjoyable it is to read. But I have a very visual imagination. I get the impression you probably do too. I don't always envisage my characters very clearly, particularly not my main characters, because I think because I'm in their head, I don't know about you, but I don't spend a ton of time in my day thinking about how I look. At least I didn't until we all got on Zoom, and now obviously
it's a nightmare.
I'm looking at my own face thinking, God, why do I make that stupid expression? But in a normal day, I don't wander around with a consciousness of how I look to other people. So I think when I'm in the heads of my main characters, I'm thinking about how the world looks to them. I'm not thinking about how they look to the world. But yeah, other than that, it is very much like watching a film. I see my settings very clearly. I think we both love writing about houses. So if I'm, have a setting like that, I often map it out because I find it really important to sort of know how everything fits together. So yeah, definitely identify with that.
Yeah, it has to. And you have to do a lot of research. Like one of the things that I've found reading your work, like The Death of Mrs. Westaway, you went into such fantastic detail on the tarot. And from reading your after notes, I know you did some research on that. Obviously, in Turn of the Key and One by One and now 0 Days, you're delving into the technological world quite a bit. And I imagine, and you talked about listening to podcasts, what other research tools did you use when you were doing the research for 0 Days so that you felt like you could see it?
Yeah, no, so it's funny actually you mentioned Mrs. Westaway, because that was one of the things that made me want to write Jack in a way, because I enjoyed writing Hal, who's the main character in The Death of Mrs. Westaway, so much. And she is a tarot reader, which is something that I knew nothing about when I started researching the book. I'd never even picked up a tarot deck. And I found it so integral to her character and such an interesting way to for someone to see the world, to see it in terms of tarot cards and to see it in terms of the way she interacts with people, the way she reads people, the way she's constantly assessing people. And I loved writing about someone whose job was so central to their sense of identity. And I think when I found out about pen testers as a role, I had the sense that I could create someone similarly interesting and ambiguous in Jack. So yeah, there's definitely a sort of a line drawn through there. But yeah, in terms of research, a lot of the research was done sort of without really realizing it, because I'd written 2 kind of tech adjacent books with One by One and The Turn of the Key, both of which have a sort of a techie storyline. I had a lot of tech podcasts on my radar already, because I'd had to go through the whole process of, how do you invent an app, and how do you, do a tech startup, and what does that look like from the inside, and how do you start a company from scratch? So I'd been sort of researching all of this. And then during lockdown, like a lot of other people, I think I started listening to a lot more podcasts. And in my case, that was because I wasn't writing, I wasn't really working. My kids were off school. I was attempting to homeschool them, which, let's just say, there's a reason I didn't become a school teacher, and I think my kids would concur. But there was a lot of just dreary making the same meal over and over again, queuing for groceries because all the stores wouldn't let you in. And listening to podcasts was a way of just kind of keeping my brain active and sort of feeling like I was at least, experiencing the outside world a little bit. So I kind of plunged into lots of the podcasts that I was already listening to, but I found myself going kind of more and more towards the darker end of the spectrum and listening to more stuff about cybercrime and the dark web, and stumbled, among other things, on this great podcast called Darknet Diaries, which is all about hackers and security experts. And that was where I really sort of first began to delve into the world of pen testers. But all of that was before I really had a book in mind, because the book I wrote directly after lockdown was The It Girl. So that was kind of totally different. That was my preoccupation with the justice system. And it wasn't until I sat down after The It Girl and thought, what am I going to write next? I suddenly realized I kind of had all of this wealth of research that I hadn't done with any particular book in mind. So actually the research for the book was much more, a lot of it was about what it's like to be a fugitive. Jack goes on the run. What powers the police have in the UK to track people down. How would they go about that? I spoke to several police officers. They all said the best thing to do for research was to watch this British TV show called Hunted. I don't know if you have it over here. It might be available online. It's very gripping, and it's a reality TV show, and basically each series they have, I think it's like 12 people, but some of them pair up into teams. And they are kind of tapped on the shoulder in the middle of the night, and the producers say, right, you are now on the run. And they have kind of a few minutes to gather up all of their stuff, and they're given a very small amount of money. It's like about $100 or something like that. And then they go on the run, and they have to stay off the radar for, I think it's like 6 or 8 weeks. And then at the end of it, they have to get to a predetermined extraction point. And if they get there, they win. But on the other side are a team of hunters who have basically the same powers as the police do in real life. Obviously slightly dramatized for TV. But it's psychologically so interesting. And the whole thing about, being on the run in the UK is weird, because as a country, we're in some ways like an ideal place to be on the run, you would think, in that, our climate's very temperate. You're probably not going to freeze to death. You're probably not going to die of hypothermia. We've got no grizzly bears. We don't have any poisonous snakes. So we're a very benign country in some ways. But the flip side is that we are also one of the most surveilled countries in the world. We have an incredibly extensive network of CCTV, particularly in London. It is impossible to walk across London without your entire journey being tracked. And we also have a very extensive network of automatic number plate recognition. So you can't drive anywhere without your car being tracked. And one of the big challenges for people who are on the run is transport. And then, of course, the same as in the United States, obviously they can track your credit card, they can access your bank accounts, they can tap your phone and all that side of things. But this level of surveillance in the UK makes it very difficult to be on the run. And Hunted is a really good illustration of how hard that is and the way it affects the police powers in terms of tracking people down. So that was fascinating. And one of the things that the police officers said, which was weirdly also something that people said about pen testers, was women make really good fugitives and really good pen testers. And I don't know about you, but all the books that I've read and all the films I've watched about people being on the run, there were a few that I sort of had in the back of my mind. There's a novel called Rogue Male by a writer called Geoffrey Household. He's a British writer from the 1940s. I don't know if he's very well known over here, but he wrote this series of books about this guy who kind of gets on the wrong side of the British government and has to go on the run, and they are really gripping, really tense. There's the 39 Steps by John Buchan, which is obviously the sort of granddaddy of the genre, and then, you know, there's films like The Fugitive, but they all star men. And the police officers said, actually, women make very good fugitives because people tend to underestimate them. And, you know, if you think about the practicalities of it, if you're living in a house in the middle of nowhere, you know, someone comes and knocks on your door, says, I'm really hungry, any chance I could have some food? If that person is, you know, a 6-foot muscle-bound guy who looks like he could take you out with one punch, you're probably going to say no. Or at the very least kind of, you know, maybe give them something and then shut the door. If it's a 5-foot-nothing woman, maybe with a baby bump, maybe with a limp because she's got terrible blisters, you're quite likely to say yes. And in fact, the people who won the first series of Hunted, there was one guy who looked like... when I first saw it, I was like, he's going to win. He had like all the camouflage gear, he had the water purification tablets, he had like survival skills. He was eliminated really quickly. And the people who won were these two women who were, I don't want to sound mean, but there's no other way to say this. They were quite incompetent. And one of them had a little boy, a toddler, and she missed him so much she kept phoning home, even though the police were tracking all of her numbers. And so every time she phoned home, the police would pick up her location. And eventually she missed him so much she went back to her house, which the police were surveilling, gave him a little cuddle, and then went on the run again for 6 weeks. But the reason she won was because people kept helping her, and someone gave her food, people gave her lifts, they let her stay in their house, someone lent her a caravan for a week. And I think that was something that I really, Dee touched on it earlier. In this book, it deals very much with the kind of the worst side of humanity in terms of, you know, Jack really encounters people who are out to do terrible things to her and to other people, and Gabe ends up dead because of it. And I don't know about you guys, but I know that when my phone rings these days and it's a number that I don't recognize, I don't think, oh, maybe it's a friend calling me from an unknown number. I think it's a scam. And 9 times out of 10 it is. So I think we all get very cynical about human nature. But one thing that I really wanted to show in the book is I don't fundamentally believe human beings are like that. I think, and Hunted shows this, and I think pen testing shows this, most people are lovely. Most people want to help you. Most people are good, kind people who want you to be okay. And although Jack encounters the worst of human nature in the book, she also encounters the best because people help her again and again and again.
Well, and I love that you based it on some real data. Like, I mean, it's a game show, but it is a head-to-head competition, men, women, like who's going to survive in those circumstances. And I love it feels very realistic what you write. So you can see the research you've done and like the challenges of, oh my God, where would I find food? And I'm running out of cash. And where would I go? You know, like, and the video cameras being everywhere, it's got this claustrophobic and very scary feel. Meanwhile, I read the book in a single day. I mean, you're just on the edge of your seat the entire time. I've got one more question for Ruth before we turn it over to you guys with your questions.
So be thinking, otherwise the event could end very quickly.
Well, I've got many more that we didn't even get to. But, you know, you really made your reputation on a lot of traditional style mysteries, locked room, a lot of stuff like One by One. There's some homage to Agatha Christie. You've been compared to Agatha Christie, and some will say that you're part of the golden age, this new resurgence of crime fiction, where some people say we're in a second golden age. We've got some great crime fiction writers. You obviously at the top of the list, but this is a bit of a departure. Like, this is not necessarily a traditional mystery. It's more of an action-packed thriller. And I'm curious if that was a conscious choice, or did you set out to write a mystery and find yourself in a thriller?
It's a good question. It wasn't a conscious choice in the sense of I don't sit down and think, what would the new Ruth Ware be like? Kind of. I just tend to follow a subject that I get mildly obsessed with, and end up down a rabbit hole and think of a cool character, which was very much what happened here. I think this book does have a really strong whodunit at the center of it. It's not locked room like some of my previous ones, but it has what I've sort of come to think of as something of my trademark in terms of a very tight cast of characters. There's a very limited number of suspects, which means you can really kind of dig down into their character and find out interesting snippets about them. But I think it's true that the question at the heart of most of my books is who did it. And that's definitely the question that Jack would say is the heart of this book. For her, what happened to Gabe and can she get justice for him is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that she cares about. She's not even really doing this to clear her name, because by the end of the novel, I don't think she really cares what happens to her. She's fed everything into this obsession, and she doesn't really see much point in going on after she has found out what happened to Gabe and who did it to him. But I think the question from the point of view of the reader, and certainly the question for me as I was writing it, what I wanted to find out was, is Jack going to be okay? It's really a novel about grief, about overcoming grief, about overcoming the worst thing that can happen to you. And the beating heart of the novel is whether Jack is going to be able to get over this, to realise that there is value in her own life, that there is a reason to keep going on even though the worst has happened to her. And that, for me, I think is the question at the heart of the novel. Is Jack going to be all right?
Oh, I love that. And it really, that is what you care about when you get to the end. And by the way, it doesn't end, not all is lost. I will say that she goes through a lot, but I loved the ending. So we'd like to open it up. I think we're on schedule. If you guys have questions for Ruth, there's a microphone going around, so please raise your hand, and we will give you a chance.
Hi.
Hi, back here, way back here.
Hi, we can see
Hi,
you.
Ruth, love you. So you do write a lot in first person, and you always have a very strong female lead, and you do write in present day. Have you ever toyed with the idea of writing from a male point of view or writing in a different time era?
Yes, is the short answer. I definitely would write from the perspective of a male, in the sense of I wouldn't let it stop me if that was what I wanted to do. But I think fundamentally part of the reason I write is to talk about my experience of being a woman in the 21st century and what that feels like. And I don't think I've finished all I have to say on that subject. So until I have, I'm not sure I could see myself doing a dual perspective with a male narrator. But I think I'd probably do a historical novel before I did that. I loved writing The Death of Mrs. Westaway, which isn't a historical novel, but it has a very kind of gothic, old-fashioned feel. And yeah, I could imagine myself writing, something kind of faintly Jane Eyre-ish, set in, Victorian England in a crumbling old house. It's definitely not going to be the next book, but never say never.
And I love the way you play with timelines in your stories. You have a lot of dual timelines or stepping back in time to the past, something that happened. That's one of the things that I'm a junkie for. I love, and I think you do so well.
I love a dual timeline. Do we have any more questions? There was a lady down the front, I think.
Yeah, I see hands everywhere. Come on.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
So my question is a little bit broader. So my husband got a new job, and so I'm thinking very much about like his ladder. And I was sitting here wondering, like, as an author, what is your goal? What is your dream? You're living the dream. You're putting out a book a year, and everyone is reading them. So, like, do you have a dream? Are you living the dream? It's ambiguous.
God, great question. I think one of the it's probably both. I'd love to know Dee's thoughts on this as well. It's both a nice thing and a very discombobulating thing about being an author is that there is no ladder. There's no sense of progression, and the fact that you've written a really good book doesn't necessarily mean that your next book will be even better. It's not, you can't get a promotion just because you've demonstrated your ability to write a novel. And that, in some ways, it's very freeing, but in some ways, it's very depressing. And I have writer friends who are brilliant writers, very, very experienced, award-winning, and some of them can't make a living. And there's no sort of career progression where you can say, because I've been doing this for X years, I therefore deserve a wage at this level. It doesn't work like that. I do consider myself to be living the dream. I am endlessly grateful to be a full-time writer. I was not for many years. I wrote alongside a day job. I am very happy. I'm very grateful that I now can do it full-time. I guess if I had a dream, maybe it would be to see one of my books made into a TV show or a film. I would love that, as long as it was a good one. Would you identify with that, Dee?
Oh, I agree with everything you said. I mean, it's like any musician, artist, anybody that's involved in the arts. It's not great job security. And I've gone from working as an engineer to having a best-selling novel and being a full-time writer for several years. And now I'm going to be working on having a steady, honest living on the side, and I want to keep writing. But it's fabulous to have a trajectory if you can have multiple successful books. And I think Ruth is building an amazing brand. So well done. And that is the dream, to have the ability to continue to publish. And so writers that have published and then are not anymore. I mean, I've met several talented writers that had their moment and then they've gone on to do other fabulous things, either adjacent to writing or in other careers. It's just there's no guarantees, unfortunately. But it's really exciting to see an author having such success. So.
We probably have time for one more question.
Oh my God, sorry, we've been talking too long.
Hi.
Hi.
I was curious to know if you had another character in mind yet for like your next book.
Ooh. Well, I'm working on my next book, but it's very difficult because this. I don't know if you find this too deep, but I'm always, when you're writing, it's always at the point at which your previous book is really nice and polished and, it's been edited and it's looking great. And then you go on tour to talk about that book and people ask you about your next book, and the next book is in a real ugly duckling stage because it's like, it's not finished, it's not edited, there's lots of scrappy loose ends, you haven't quite figured out what's happening in the middle. So I always feel a bit superstitious about talking about what I'm working on in case I say what it's about and then my editor's like, yeah, this isn't very good. So I will tell you a little bit, but you have to promise not to mention it outside of this room, particularly not if my next book doesn't turn out to be about this, because then you will know that in fact it did not turn out to be any good. So I think my next book is going to be a sort of Love Island murder mystery. Love Island, the reality TV show. It's like a group of beautiful young people on a desert island for a dreams come true reality TV show, and then there's murder.
That sounds fantastic. I don't know. I would buy that. Would you guys buy that? Love Island Murders? So we don't have time for another question?
No, I'm I'm sorry.
Sorry. Ask us in the queue.
Yes, but we are pulling for you. You've had several books optioned, and there are some things in the works. So those of you who are hoping for, including you, movie, TV show, fingers crossed. And thank you all so much, and thank you to Hudson Library. We will see you guys
And
in the
thank you to
rotunda.
you.
And thank you, Ruth.